Section 15 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. The Story of Abu Hassan, or the Sleeper Awakened, Part 5. The Caliph, who thought that he was perfectly well informed of the death of the slave, and had just reason to believe so, because he had both seen and heard Abu Hassan, laughed and shrugged up his shoulders to hear Zobeide talk in this manner. "Mesrour," said he to the eunuch, "what do you think of the princess's discourse? Do not women sometimes lose their senses? For you have heard and seen all as well as myself." Then, turning to Zobeide, "Madam," said he, "shed no more tears for Abu Hassan, for I can assure you he is well; but rather bewail the death of your dear slave. It is not many moments since her husband came in the most inexpressible affliction, to tell me of the death of his wife. I gave him a purse of 100 pieces of gold and a piece of brocade to comfort him and bury her, and Mesrour, who was present, can tell you the same." The princess took this discourse of the caliph's to be all a jest, and thought he had a mind to impose upon her. "Commander of the faithful," replied she, "though you are used to banter, I must tell you this is not a proper time for pleasantry. What I tell you is very serious. I do not talk of my slave's death, but of Abu Hassan's, her husband, whose fate I bewail, and so ought you to." "Madam," said the caliph, putting on a grave countenance, "I tell you without raillery that you are deceived. Nouzhatoul Aouadat is dead, and Abu Hassan is alive, and in perfect health." Zobeide was much piqued at this dry answer of the caliph. "Commander of the faithful," replied she smartly, "God preserve you from continuing longer in this mistake. Surely you would make me think your mind is not as usual. Give me leave to repeat to you once more that it is Abu Hassan who is dead, and that my slave Nouzhatoul Aouadat, his widow, is living. It is not an hour since she went from hence. She came here in so disconsolate a state, that the sight of her was enough to have drawn tears from my eyes, if she had not told me her affliction. All my women who wept with me can bear me witness, and tell you also that I made her a present of 100 pieces of gold and a piece of brocade. The grief which you found me in was on account of the death of her husband, and just at the instant you entered I was going to send you a compliment of condolence." At these words of Zobeide, the caliph cried out in a fit of laughter, "This, madam, is a strange piece of obstinacy; but," continued he seriously, "you may depend upon Nouzhatoul Aouadat's being dead." "I tell you no, sir," replied Zobeide sharply. "It is Abu Hassan that is dead, and you shall never make me believe otherwise." Upon this, the caliph's anger rose in his countenance. He seated himself on the sofa at some distance from the princess, and speaking to Mesrour, said, "Go immediately, see which it is, and bring me word; for though I am certain that it is Nouzhatoul Aouadat, I would rather take this method than be any longer obstinately positive about the matter, though of its certainty I am perfectly satisfied." No sooner had the caliph commanded him than Mesrour was gone. "You will see," continued he, addressing himself to Zobeide, "in a moment, which of us is right." "For my part," replied Zobeide, "I know very well that I am in the right, and you will find it to be Abu Hassan." "And for myself," returned the caliph, "I am so sure that it is Nouzhatoul Aouadat, that I will lay you what wager you please that Abu Hassan is well." "Do not think to come off so," said Zobeide. "I accept your wager, and I am so well persuaded of his death, that I would willingly lay the thing dearest to me in the world against what you will, though it were of less value. You know what I have in my disposal, and what I value most. Propose the bet, and I will stand to it." "Since it is so," replied the caliph, "I will lay my garden of pleasures against your palace of paintings, though the one is worth much more than the other." "Is the question at present," replied Zobeide, if your garden is more valuable than my palace. That is not the point. You have made choice of what you thought fit belonging to me, as an equivalent against what you lay. I accept the wager, and that I will abide by it, I take God to witness." The caliph took the same oath, and both waited Mesrour's return. While the caliph and Zobeide were disputing so earnestly and with so much warmth, Abu Hassan, who foresaw their difference, was very attentive to whatever might happen. As soon as he perceived Mesrour through a window, at which he sat talking with his wife, and observed that he was coming directly to their apartment, he guessed his commission, and bade his wife make haste to act the dead part once more, as they had agreed, without loss of time. But they were so pressed, that Abu Hassan had much ado to wrap up his wife and lay the piece of brocade which the caliph had given him upon her, before Mesrour reached the house. This done, he opened the door of his apartment, and with a melancholy, dejected countenance, and his handkerchief before his eyes, went and sat down at the head of the pretended deceased. By the time he was seated, Mesrour came into the room. The dismal sight which met his eyes gave him a secret joy on account of the errand the caliph had sent him on. Abu Hassan rose up to meet him, and kissing his hand out of respect, said, sighing and sobbing, "You see me under the greatest calamity that ever could have befallen me, the death of my dear wife, Nouzhatul Aoudat, whom you honoured with your favours." Mesrour, affected by this discourse, could not refuse some tears to the memory of the deceased. He lifted up the cloth a little at the head, and peeping under it, let it down again, and said with a deep sigh, "There is no other God but Allah. We must all submit to his will, and every creature must return to him. Nouzhatul Aoudat, my good sister," added he, sighing, "thy days have been few. God have mercy on thee." Then turning to Abu Hassan, who was all the time in tears, "We may well say," added he, "that women sometimes have whims, and lose their senses in a most unpardonable manner; for Zobeide, good mistress as she is in that situation at present. She will maintain to the caliph that you are dead, and not your wife; and whatever the caliph can say to the contrary, he cannot persuade her otherwise. He called me to witness and confirm this truth, for you know I was present when you came and told him the sorrowful news. But all signifies nothing. They are both positive, and the caliph, to convince Zobeide, has sent me to know the truth. But I fear I shall not be believed, for when women once take up a thing, they are not to be beaten out of it." "God keep the commander of the faithful in the possession and right use of his senses," replied Abu Hassan, still sighing and weeping. "You see how it is, and that I have not imposed upon his majesty; and I wish to heaven," continued he, to dissemble the better, "that I had no occasion to have told him the melancholy and afflicting news. Alas! I cannot enough express my irreparable loss." "That is true," replied Mesrour, "and I can assure you I take a great share in your affliction; but you must be comforted, and not abandon yourself to your grief. I leave you with reluctance to return to the caliph, but I beg the favour of you not to bury the corpse till I come again, for I will assist at the interment, and accompany it with my prayers." Mesrour went to give an account of his visit. Abu Hassan attended him to the door, told him he did not deserve the honour he intended him, and for fear Mesrour should return to say something else, followed him with his eyes for some time, and when he saw him at a distance, returned to his wife and released her. "This is already," said he, "a new scene of mirth, but I fancy it will not be the last; for certainly the princess Zobeide will not believe Mesrour, but will laugh at him, since she has too substantial a reason to the contrary. Therefore we must expect some new event." While Abu Hassan was talking thus, Nouzhatul Aoudat had time to put on her clothes again, and both went and sat down on a sofa opposite to the window, where they could see all that passed. In the meantime, Mesrour reached Zobeide's apartment, and going into her closet laughing, clapped his hands like one who had something very agreeable to tell. The caliph, naturally impatient, and piqued a little at the princess's contradiction, as soon as he saw Mesrour, "Vile slave," said he, "is this a time to laugh? Why do not you tell me which is dead, the husband or the wife?" "Commander of the faithful," answered Mesrour, putting on a serious countenance, "it is Nouzhatoul aouadat who is dead, for the loss of whom Abou Hassan is as much afflicted as when he appeared before your majesty." The caliph, not giving him time to pursue his story, interrupted him, and cried out, laughing heartily, "Good news! Zobeide, your mistress, was a moment ago possessed of the palace of paintings, and now it is mine. She staked it against my garden of pleasures, since you went. Therefore you could not have done me greater pleasure. I will take care to reward you. But give me a true account of what you saw." "Commander of the faithful," said Mesrour, "when I came to Abou Hassan's apartment, I found the door open, and he was bewailing the death of his wife. He sat at the head of the deceased, who was laid out in the middle of the room, with her feet towards Mecca, and was covered with the piece of brocade which your majesty presented to Abou Hassan. After I had expressed the share I took in his grief, I went and lifted up the pall at the head, and knew Nouzhatoul aouadat, though her face was much swelled and changed. I exhorted Abou Hassan in the best manner I could to be comforted, and when I came away, told him I would attend at his wife's funeral, and desired him not to remove the corpse till I came. This is all I can tell your majesty." "I ask no more," said the caliph, laughing heartily, "and I am well satisfied with your exactness." Then addressing himself to Zobeide, "Well, madam," said he, "have you yet anything to say against so certain a truth? Will you still believe that Nouzhatoul aouadat is alive, and that Abou Hassan is dead? And will you not own that you have lost your wager?" "How, sir?" replied Zobeide, who would not believe one word Mesrour said. "Do you think that I regard that impertinent fellow of a slave, who knows not what he says? I am not blind or mad. With these eyes I saw Nouzhatoul aouadat in the greatest affliction. I spoke to her myself, and she told me that her husband was dead." "Madam," replied Mesrour, "I swear to you by your own life, and that of the commander of the faithful, which are both dear to me, that Nouzhatoul aouadat is dead, and Abou Hassan is living." "Thou liest, base despicable slave," said Zobeide in a rage, "and I will confound thee immediately." Clapping her hands together, she called her women, who all approached. "Come hither," said the princess to them, "and speak the truth. Who was that who came and spoke with me a little before the caliph entered?" The women all answered that it was poor afflicted Nouzhatoul aouadat. "And what," added she, addressing herself to her treasurer, "did I order you to give her?" "Madam," answered the treasurer, "I gave Nouzhatoul aouadat, by your orders, a purse of 100 pieces of gold and a piece of brocade, which she carried away with her." "Well then, sorry slave," said Zobeide to Mesrour in passion, "what have you to say to all this? Whom do you think now I ought to believe, you or my treasurer, my women, and myself?" Mesrour did not want for arguments to contradict the princess, but as he was afraid of provoking her too much, chose rather to be silent, though he was satisfied that the wife was dead and not the husband. During the whole of this dispute between Zobeide and Mesrour, the caliph, who heard the evidence on both sides, and was persuaded of the contrary of what the princess asserted, because he had himself seen and spoken to Abou Hassan, and from what Mesrour had told him, laughed heartily to see Zobeide so exasperated. "Madam," said he to her, "once more I repeat that I know not who was the author of that saying, that women sometimes lose their wits, but I am sure you make it good. Mesrour has just come from Abu Hassan's, and tells you that he saw Nouzhatul Aouadat lying dead in the middle of the room, Abu Hassan alive and sitting by her. And yet you will not believe this evidence, which nobody can reasonably refuse. I cannot comprehend this conduit." Zobeide would not hear the caliph. "Pardon me, commander of the faithful," replied she, "if I suspect you. I see that you have contrived with Mesrour to vex me and to try my patience; and as I perceive that this report was concerted between you, I beg leave to send a person to Abu Hassan's, to know whether or not I am in the wrong." The caliph consented, and the princess charged with this important commission an old nurse who had lived with her from her infancy. "Hark you, nurse," said she, "you see my dispute with the commander of the faithful and Mesrour. I need tell you no more. Go to Abu Hassan's, or rather to Nouzhatul Aouadat's, for Abu Hassan is dead, and clear up this matter for me. If you bring me good news, a handsome present is your reward. Make haste and return immediately." The nurse set out, to the great joy of the caliph, who was delighted to see Zobeide in this embarrassment. But Mesrour, extremely mortified to find the princess so angry with him, did all he could to appease her, and to make her and the caliph both satisfied with him. He was overjoyed when Zobeide sent the nurse, because he was persuaded that the report she must make would agree with his, justify him, and restore him to her favour. In the meantime, Abu Hassan, who watched at the window, perceived the nurse at a distance, and guessing that she was sent by Zobeide, called his wife and told her that the princess's nurse was coming to know the truth. "Therefore," said he, "make haste and lay me out." Accordingly, Nouzhatul Aouadat covered him with the brocade Zobeide had given her, and put his turban upon his face. The nurse, eager to acquit herself of her commission, hobbled as fast as age would allow her, and entering the room, perceived Nouzhatul Aouadat in tears, her hair dishevelled, and seated at the head of her husband, beating her breast, with all the expressions of violent grief. The good old nurse went directly to the false widow. "My dear Nouzhatul Aouadat," said she, with a sorrowful countenance, "I come not to interrupt your grief and tears for a husband whom you loved so tenderly." "Ah, good mother," replied the counterfeit widow, "you see my misfortune, and how unhappy I am from the loss of my beloved Abu Hassan. Abu Hassan, my dear husband," cried she, "what have I done that you should leave me so soon? Have I not always preferred your will to my own? Alas, what will become of poor Nouzhatul Aouadat?" "This black-faced Mesrour," cried the nurse, lifting up her hands, "deserves to be punished for having caused so great a difference between my good mistress and the commander of the faithful, by the falsehood he has told them. Daughter," continued she, "that villain Mesrour has asserted with inconceivable impudence before our good mistress that you were dead, and Abu Hassan was alive." "Alas, my good mother," cried Nouzhatul Aouadat, "I wish to heaven that it was true. I should not be in this sorrowful state, nor bewail a husband so dear to me." At these words she wept afresh, and with redoubled tears and cries feigned the deepest sorrow. The nurse was so much moved by her tears, that she sat down by her and cried too. Then, gently lifting up the turban and cloth, looked at the face of the corpse. "Ah, poor Abu Hassan," she cried, covering his face again, "God have mercy upon thee. Adieu, child," said she to Nouzhatul Aouadat. "If I could stay longer with you, I would with all my heart, but I am obliged to return immediately, to deliver my mistress from the uneasiness that black villain has occasioned her by his impudent lie, assuring her with an oath that you were dead." As soon as the nurse was gone, Nouzhatul Aouadat wiped her eyes and released Abu Hassan. They both went and sat down on a sofa against the window, expecting what would be the end of this stratagem, and to be ready to act according as circumstances might require. The nurse in the meantime made all the haste she could to go to Zobeide. The pleasure of carrying the princess news favourable to her wager, but still more the hopes of a good reward, added wings to her feet, and running into the princess's closet quite out of breath, she gave her a true account of all she had seen. Zobeide hearkened to the old woman's relation with a most sensible pleasure, and when she had done, said, with a tone which showed triumph at having, as she supposed, won her wager, "Repeat it once more before the caliph, who looks upon us all to be fools, who would make us believe we have no sense of religion nor fear of God, and tell your story to that wicked black slave who had the insolence to assert a wilful falsehood." Mesrour, who expected the nurse's report would prove favourable on his side, was much mortified to find it so much the contrary, and so vexed at the anger Zobeide expressed against him for a thing which he thought himself surer of than anybody, that he was glad of an opportunity of speaking his mind freely to the old woman, which he durst not do to the princess. "Old toothless," said he to the nurse, "you are a liar, and there is no truth in what you say, for I saw with my own eyes Nouzhatoul Aouadat laid out in the middle of the room." "You are a notorious liar yourself," replied the nurse with an insulting air, "to dare maintain so great a falsity before my face, who am just come from seeing Abou Hassan dead laid out, and have left his wife alive." "I am not an impostor," replied Mesrour. "It is you who endeavour to lead us all into error." "What impudence," said the nurse, "to dare tell me I lie in the presence of their majesties, when I saw just now with my own eyes what I have had the honour to tell them." "Indeed, nurse," answered Mesrour again, "you had better hold your tongue, for you certainly don't." Zobeide, who could no longer endure this want of respect in Mesrour, who, without any regard to her, treated her nurse so injuriously in her presence, without giving the old lady time to reply to so gross an affront, said to the caliph, "Commander of the faithful, I demand justice for this insolence to us both." She was so enraged she could say no more, but burst into tears. The caliph, who had heard all the dispute, thought it very intricate. He mused some time, and could not tell what to think of so many contradictions. The princess, on her part, as well as Mesrour, the nurse, and all the women slaves who were present, were as much puzzled, and remained silent. At last the caliph, addressing himself to Zobeide, said, "I see we are all liars, myself first, then you, Mesrour, and you, nurse, or at least it seems not one can be believed more than the other. Therefore let us go ourselves to examine the truth, for I can see no other way to clear up these doubts." So saying, the caliph arose. The princess followed him, and Mesrour went before to open the doors. "Commander of the faithful," said he, "I am overjoyed that your majesty has taken this course, and shall be much more when I shall make it plainly appear to the nurse, not that she dotes, since the expression is unfortunately displeasing to my good mistress, but that her report is not true." The nurse wanted not a reply. "Hold your tongue, black face," said she, "you dote yourself." Zobeide, who was much provoked at Mesrour, could not bear to hear him attack her nurse again without taking her part. "Vile slave," said she, "say what you will, I maintain my nurse speaks the truth, and look upon you as a mere liar." "Madam," replied Mesrour, "if nurse is so very certain that Nouzhatoul Aouadat is alive, and Abou Hassan dead, I will lay her what she dares of it." The nurse was as ready as he. "I dare," said she, "take you at your word. Let us see if you dare unsay it." Mesrour stood to his word, and they laid a piece of gold brocade with silver flowers before the caliph and the princess. The apartment from which the caliph and Zobeide set out, though distant from Abu Hassan's, was nevertheless just opposite, so that he perceived them coming, and told his wife that he was much mistaken if the caliph and Zobeide, preceded by Mesrour, and followed by a great number of women, were not about to do them the honour of a visit. She looked through a lattice and saw them, seemed frightened, and cried out, "What shall we do? We are ruined." "Fear nothing," replied Abu Hassan. "Have you forgotten already what we agreed on? We will both feign ourselves dead, and you shall see all will go well. At the slow rate they are coming, we shall be ready before they reach the door." Accordingly, Abu Hassan and his wife wrapped up and covered themselves with the pieces of brocade, and waited patiently for their visitors. Mesrour, who came first, opened the door, and the caliph and Zobeide, followed by their attendants, entered the room, but were struck with horror, and stood motionless at the spectacle which presented itself to their view, not knowing what to think. At length Zobeide, breaking silence, said to the caliph, "Alas, they are both dead!" "You have done much," continued she, looking at the caliph and Mesrour, "to endeavour to make me believe that my dear slave was dead, and I find it is true. Grief at the loss of her husband has certainly killed her." "Say rather, madam," answered the caliph, prepossessed to the contrary, that Nouzhatoul died first. "The afflicted Abu Hassan sunk under his grief, and could not survive his dear wife. You ought therefore to confess that you have lost your wager, and that your palace of paintings is mine." "Hold there," answered Zobeide, warmed at being contradicted by the caliph. "I will maintain you have lost your garden of pleasures. Abu Hassan died first, since my nurse told you as well as me that she saw her alive, and weeping for the death of her husband." The dispute of the caliph and Zobeide brought on another between Mesrour and the nurse, who had wagered as well as they. Each affirmed to have won, and at length they proceeded to abuse each other very grossly. At last the caliph, reflecting on what had passed, began to think that Zobeide had as much reason as himself to maintain that she had won. In this embarrassment of not being able to find out the truth, he advanced towards the corpses, and sat down at the head, searching for some expedient that might gain him the victory over Zobeide. "I swear," cried he presently after, "by the holy name of God, that I will give 1,000 pieces of gold to him who can tell me which of these two died first." No sooner were these words out of the caliph's mouth than he heard a voice under Abu Hassan's piece of brocade say, "Commander of the faithful, I died first. Give me the 1,000 pieces of gold." At the same instant Abu Hassan threw off the piece of brocade, and springing up, prostrated himself at his feet, while his wife did the same to Zobeide, keeping on her piece of brocade out of decency. The princess at first shrieked out, but recovering herself, expressed great joy to see her dear slave rise again, just when she was almost inconsolable at having seen her dead. "Ah, wicked Nouzhatoul Aoudat!" cried she, "what have I suffered for your sake? However, I forgive you from my heart, since you are not dead." The caliph was not so much surprised when he heard Abu Hassan's voice, but thought he should have died with laughing at this unravelling of the mystery, and to hear Abu Hassan ask so seriously for the 1,000 pieces of gold. "What, Abu Hassan," said he, continuing to laugh aloud, "hast thou conspired against my life to kill me a second time with laughing? How came this thought into your head to surprise Zobeide and me thus, when we least thought of such a trick?" "Commander of the faithful," replied Abu Hassan, "I will declare to your majesty the whole truth, without the least reserve. Your majesty knows that I always loved to eat and drink well, and the wife you gave me rather increased than restrained this propensity. With these dispositions, your majesty may easily suppose we might spend a good estate. And to make short of my story, we were not sparing of what your Majesty so generously gave us. This morning, accounting with our caterer, who took care to provide everything for us, and paying what we owed him, we found we had nothing left. Then reflections on what was past, and resolutions to manage better for the future, crowded into our thoughts. We formed 1,000 projects, all of which we rejected. At last, the shame of seeing ourselves reduced to so low a condition, and not daring to tell your Majesty, made us contrive this stratagem to relieve our necessities and to divert you, which we hope your Majesty will be pleased to pardon." The Caliph was satisfied with Abu Hassan's sincerity, and Zobeide, who had till now been very seriously, began to laugh at the thought of Abu Hassan's scheme. The Caliph, who had not ceased laughing at the singularity of the adventure, rising, said to Abu Hassan and his wife, "Follow me. I will give you the 1,000 pieces of gold I promised, for joy to find you are not dead." Zobeide desired him to let her make her slave a present of the same sum, for the same reason. By this means Abu Hassan and his wife Nouzhatul Aoudat preserved the favour of the Caliph Haroun al Rashid and the Princess Zobeide, and by their liberalities were enabled to pursue their pleasures. End of section 15. End of the story of Abu Hassan, or the Sleeper Awakened. Chapter 16 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. The Story of Ala ad-Din, or the Wonderful Lamp, Part 1. In the capital of one of the large and rich provinces of the Kingdom of China, the name of which I do not recollect, there lived a tailor named Mustapha, who was so poor that he could hardly, by his daily labour, maintain himself and his family, which consisted of a wife and son. His son, who was called Ala ad-Din, had been brought up in a very careless and idle manner, and by that means had contracted many vicious habits. He was wicked, obstinate, and disobedient to his father and mother, who, when he grew up, could not keep him within doors. He was in the habit of going out early in the morning, and would stay out all day, playing in the streets and public places with idle children of his own age. When he was old enough to learn a trade, his father, not being able to put him out to any other, took him into his own shop, and taught him how to use his needle. But neither fair words nor the fear of chastisement were capable of fixing his lively genius. All his father's endeavours to keep him to his work were in vain, for no sooner was his back turned than he was gone for that day. Mustapha chastised him, but Ala ad-Din was incorrigible, and his father, to his great relief, was forced to abandon him to his idleness, and was so much troubled at not being able to reclaim him, that it threw him into a fit of sickness, of which he died in a few months. The mother, finding that her son would not follow his father's business, shut up the shop, sold off the implements of trade, and with the money she received for them, and what she could get by spinning cotton, thought to maintain herself and her son. Ala ad-Din, who was now no longer restrained by the fear of a father, and who cared so little for his mother, that whenever she chid him he would abuse her, gave himself entirely over to his idle habits, and was never out of the streets from his companions. This course he followed till he was 15 years old, without giving his mind to any useful pursuit, or the least reflection on what would become of him. In this situation, as he was one day playing according to custom in the street, with his vagabond associates, a stranger passing by stood to observe him. This stranger was a sorcerer, called by the writer of this story the African magician. He was a native of Africa, and had been but 2 days arrived from thence. The African magician, who was a good physiognomist, observing in Ala ad-Din's countenance something absolutely necessary for the execution of the design he was engaged in, inquired artfully about his family, who he was, and what were his inclinations. And when he had learned all he desired to know, went up to him, and taking him aside from his comrades, said, "Child, was not your father called Mustapha the tailor?" "Yes, sir," answered the boy, "but he has been dead a long time." At these words the African magician threw his arms about Alla ad Deen's neck, and kissed him several times with tears in his eyes. Alla ad Deen, who observed his tears, asked him what made him weep. "Alas, my son," cried the African magician with a sigh, "how can I forbear? I am your uncle. Your worthy father was my own brother. I have been many years abroad, and now I am come home with the hopes of seeing him. You tell me he is dead. I assure you it is a sensible grief to me to be deprived of the comfort I expected, but it is some relief to my affliction that as far as I can remember him, I knew you at first sight, you are so like him, and I see I am not deceived." Then he asked Alla ad Deen, putting his hand into his purse, where his mother lived, and as soon as he had informed him, gave him a handful of small money, saying, "Go, my son, to your mother, give my love to her, and tell her that I will visit her tomorrow if I have time, that I may have the satisfaction of seeing where my good brother lived so long, and ended his days." As soon as the African magician left his newly adopted nephew, Alla ad Deen ran to his mother, overjoyed at the money his uncle had given him. "Mother," said he, "have I an uncle?" "No, child," replied his mother, "you have no uncle by your father's side or mine." "I am just now come," said Alla ad Deen, "from a man who says he is my uncle by my father's side, assuring me that he is his brother. He cried and kissed me when I told him my father was dead. And to show you that what I tell you is truth," added he, pulling out the money, "see what he has given me. He charged me to give his love to you, and to tell you if he has any time tomorrow, he will come and pay you a visit, that he may see the house my father lived and died in." "Indeed, child," replied the mother, "your father had a brother, but he has been dead a long time, and I never heard of another." The mother and son talked no more then of the African magician, but the next day Alla ad Deen's uncle found him playing in another part of the town with other children, and embracing him as before, put 2 pieces of gold into his hand, and said to him, "Carry this child to your mother, tell her that I will come and see her tonight, and bid her get us something for supper, but first show me the house where you live." After Alla ad Deen had showed the African magician the house, he carried the 2 pieces of gold to his mother, and when he had told her of his uncle's intention, she went out and bought provisions, and considering she wanted various utensils, borrowed them of her neighbours. She spent the whole day in preparing the supper, and at night when it was ready, said to her son, "Perhaps your uncle knows not how to find our house. Go and bring him if you meet with him." Though Alla ad Deen had showed the magician the house, he was ready to go, when somebody knocked at the door, which he immediately opened, and the magician came in loaded with wine and all sorts of fruits, which he brought for a dessert. After the African magician had given what he brought into Alla ad Deen's hands, he saluted his mother, and desired her to show him the place where his brother Mustapha used to sit on the sofa, and when she had so done, he fell down and kissed it several times, crying out with tears in his eyes, "My poor brother, how unhappy am I not to have come soon enough to give you one last embrace." Alla ad Deen's mother desired him to sit down in the same place, but he declined. "No," said he, "I shall take care how I do that, but give me leave to sit opposite to it, that although I am deprived of the satisfaction of seeing the master of a family so dear to me, I may at least have the pleasure of beholding the place where he used to sit." The widow pressed him no farther, but left him at liberty to sit where he pleased. When the magician had made choice of a place and sat down, he began to enter into discourse with Alla ad Deen's mother. "My good sister," said he, "do not be surprised at your never having seen me all the time you have been married to my brother Mustapha of happy memory. I have been 40 years absent from this country, which is my native place as well as my late brother's, and during that time have travelled into the Indies, Persia, Arabia, Syria, and Egypt, have resided in the finest towns of those countries, and afterwards crossed over into Africa, where I made a longer stay. At last, as it is natural for a man, how distant soever it may be, to remember his native country, relations, and acquaintance, I was desirous to see mine again, and to embrace my dear brother, and finding I had strength enough to undertake so long a journey, I immediately made the necessary preparations and set out. I will not tell you the length of time it took me, all the obstacles I met with, and what fatigues I have endured to come hither, but nothing ever mortified and afflicted me so much, and hearing of my brother's death, for whom I always had a brotherly love and friendship, I observed his features in the face of my nephew your son, and distinguished him among a number of children with whom he was at play. He can tell you how I received the most melancholy news that ever reached my ears. But God be praised for all things. It is a comfort for me to find, as it were, my brother in a son, who has his most remarkable features." The African magician, perceiving that the widow began to weep at the remembrance of her husband, changed the conversation, and turning towards her son, asked him his name. "I am called Alla ad Deen," said he. "Well, Alla ad Deen," replied the magician, "what business do you follow? Are you of any trade?" At this question the youth hung down his head, and was not a little abashed when his mother answered, "Alla ad Deen is an idle fellow. His father, when alive, strove all he could to teach him his trade, but could not succeed; and since his death, notwithstanding all I can say to him, he does nothing but idle away his time in the streets, as you saw him, without considering he is no longer a child; and if you do not make him ashamed of it, I despair of his ever coming to any good. He knows that his father left him no fortune, and sees me endeavour to get bread by spinning cotton. For my part, I am resolved one of these days to turn him out of doors, and let him provide for himself." After these words, Alla ad Deen's mother burst into tears, and the magician said, "This is not well, nephew. You must think of helping yourself, and getting your livelihood. There are many sorts of trades. Consider if you have not an inclination to some of them. Perhaps you do not like your father's, and would prefer another. Come, do not disguise your sentiments from me. I will endeavour to help you." But finding that Alla ad Deen returned no answer, "If you have no mind," continued he, "to learn any handicraft, I will take a shop for you, furnish it with all sorts of fine stuffs and linens, and with the money you make of them lay in fresh goods, and then you will live in an honourable way. Consult your inclination, and tell me freely what you think of my proposal. You shall always find me ready to keep my word." This plan greatly flattered Alla ad Deen, who hated work, but had sense enough to know that such shops were much frequented, and the owners respected. He told the magician he had a greater inclination to that business than to any other, and that he should be much obliged to him for his kindness. "Since this profession is agreeable to you," said the African magician, "I will carry you with me tomorrow, clothe you as handsomely as the best merchants in the city, and afterwards we will think of opening a shop as I mentioned." The widow, who never till then could believe that the magician was her husband's brother, no longer doubted after his promises of kindness to her son. She thanked him for his good intentions, and after having exhorted Alla ad Deen to render himself worthy of his uncle's favour by good behaviour, served up supper, at which they talked of several indifferent matters, And then the magician, who saw that the night was pretty far advanced, took his leave and retired. He came again the next day, as he had promised, and took Alla ad Deen with him to a merchant who sold all sorts of clothes for different ages and ranks, ready-made, and a variety of fine stuffs. He asked to see some that suited Alla ad Deen in size, and after choosing a suit for himself which he liked best, and rejecting others which he did not think handsome enough, he bade Alla ad Deen choose those he preferred. Alla ad Deen, charmed with the liberality of his new uncle, made choice of one, and the magician immediately paid for it. When Alla ad Deen found himself so handsomely equipped, he returned his uncle thanks, who promised never to forsake him, but always to take him along with him, which he did to the most frequented places in the city, and particularly where the principal merchants kept their shops. When he brought him into the street where they sold the richest stuffs and finest linens, he said to Alla ad Deen, "As you are soon to be a merchant, it is proper you should frequent these shops and be acquainted with them." He then showed him the largest and finest mosques, carried him to the khans or inns where the merchants and travellers lodged, and afterwards to the sultan's palace, where he had free access, and at last brought him to his own khan, where, meeting with some merchants he had become acquainted with since his arrival, he gave them a treat to bring them and his pretended nephew acquainted. This entertainment lasted till night, when Alla ad Deen would have taken leave of his uncle to go home. The magician would not let him go by himself, but conducted him to his mother, who, as soon as she saw him so well dressed, was transported with joy, and bestowed 1,000 blessings upon the magician, for being at so great an expense upon her child. "Generous relation," said she, "I know not how to thank you for your liberality. I know that my son is not deserving of your favours, and were he ever so grateful, and answered your good intentions, he would be unworthy of them. I thank you with all my soul, and wish you may live long enough to witness my son's gratitude, which he cannot better show than by regulating his conduct by your good advice." "Alla ad Deen," replied the magician, "is a good boy, and I believe he shall do very well, but I am sorry for one thing, which is that I cannot perform tomorrow what I promised, because as it is Friday the shops will be shut up, and therefore we cannot hire or furnish one, but must wait till Saturday. I will, however, call on him tomorrow, and take him to walk in the gardens, where people of the best fashion generally resort. Perhaps he has never seen these amusements, he has only hitherto been among children, but now he must see men." The African magician took his leave of the mother and the son, and retired. Alla ad Deen, who was overjoyed to be so well clothed, anticipated the pleasure of walking in the gardens. He had never been out of the town, nor seen the environs, which were very beautiful and pleasant. Alla ad Deen rose early the next morning, dressed himself to be ready when his uncle called on him, and, after he had waited some time, began to be impatient, and stood watching at the door. But as soon as he perceived him coming, he told his mother, took his leave of her, and ran to meet him. The magician caressed Alla ad Deen, and said, "Come, my dear child, and I will show you fine things." He then led him out at one of the gates of the city to some magnificent houses, or rather palaces, to each of which belonged beautiful gardens, into which anybody might enter. At every building he came to, he asked Alla ad Deen if he did not think it fine, and the youth was ready to answer when any one presented itself, crying out, "Here is a finer house, uncle, than any we have seen yet." By this artifice the cunning magician led Alla ad Deen some way into the country, and as he meant to carry him farther to execute his design, he took an opportunity to sit down in one of the gardens on the brink of a fountain of clear water, which discharged itself by a lion's mouth of bronze into a basin, pretending to be tired. "Come, nephew," said he, "you must be weary as well as I. Let us rest ourselves, and we shall be better able to pursue our walk." After they had sat down, The magician pulled from his girdle a handkerchief with cakes and fruit which he had provided, and laid them on the edge of the basin. He broke a cake in two, gave one half to Alla ad Deen, and ate the other himself, and in regard to the fruit, left him at liberty to take which sort he liked best. During this short repast, he exhorted his nephew to leave off keeping company with vagabonds, and seek that of wise and prudent men, to improve by their conversation. "For," said he, "you will soon be at man's estate, and you cannot too early begin to imitate their example." When they had eaten as much as they liked, they got up and pursued their walk through gardens separated from one another only by small ditches, which marked out the limits without interrupting the communication, so great was the confidence the inhabitants reposed in each other. By this means the African magician drew Alla ad Deen insensibly beyond the gardens, and crossed the country, till they nearly reached the mountains. Alla ad Deen, who had never been so far before, began to find himself much tired with so long a walk, and said to the magician, "Where are we going, uncle? We have left the gardens a great way behind us, and I see nothing but mountains. If we go much farther, I do not know whether I shall be able to reach the town again." "Never fear, nephew," said the false uncle, "I will show you another garden, which surpasses all we have yet seen. It is not far off, and when we come there, you will say that you would have been sorry to have been so nigh and not seen it." Alla ad Deen was soon persuaded, and the magician, to make the way seem shorter and less fatiguing, told him a great many stories. At last they arrived between two mountains of moderate height and equal size, divided by a narrow valley, which was the place where the magician intended to execute the design that had brought him from Africa to China. "We will go no farther now," said he to Alla ad Deen. "I will show you here some extraordinary things, which, when you have seen, you will thank me for. But while I strike a light, gather up all the loose dry sticks you can see, to kindle a fire with." Alla ad Deen found so many dried sticks, that before the magician had made a light, he had collected a great heap. The magician presently set them on fire, and when they were in a blaze, threw in some incense, which raised a cloud of smoke. This he dispersed on each side by pronouncing several magical words, which Alla ad Deen did not understand. At the same time the earth, trembling, opened just before the magician, and uncovered a stone laid horizontally, with a brass ring fixed into the middle. Alla ad Deen was so frightened at what he saw that he would have run away, but the magician caught hold of him, abused him, and gave him such a box on the ear that he knocked him down. Alla ad Deen got up trembling, and, with tears in his eyes, said to the magician, "What have I done, uncle, to be treated in this severe manner?" "I have my reasons," answered the magician. "I am your uncle. I supply the place of your father, and you ought to make no reply. But, child," added he, softening, "do not be afraid, for I shall not ask anything of you but that you obey me punctually, if you would reap the advantages which I intend you." These fair promises calmed Alla ad Deen's fears and resentment, and when the magician saw that he was appeased, he said to him, "You see what I have done by virtue of my incense and the words I pronounced. Know then that under this stone there is hidden a treasure destined to be yours, and which will make you richer than the greatest monarch in the world. No person but yourself is permitted to lift this stone, or enter the cave, so you must punctually execute what I may command, for it is a matter of great consequence both to you and me." Alla ad Deen, amazed at all he saw and heard the magician say of the treasure which was to make him happy, forgot what was past, and rising said, "Well, uncle, what is to be done? Command me, I am ready to obey." "I am overjoyed, child," said the African magician, embracing him. "Take hold of the ring, and lift up that stone." "Indeed, uncle," replied Alla ad Deen. I am not strong enough. You must help me. You have no occasion for my assistance, answered the magician. If I help you, we shall be able to do nothing. Take hold of the ring, pronounce the names of your father and grandfather, then lift it up, and you will find it will come easily. Alla ad Deen did as the magician bade him, raised the stone with ease, and laid it on one side. When the stone was pulled up, there appeared a cavity of about 3 or 4 feet deep, with a little door and steps to go down lower. Observe, my son, said the African magician, what I direct. Descend into the cave, and when you are at the bottom of those steps, you will find a door open, which will lead you into a spacious vault, divided into 3 great halls, in each of which you will see 4 large brass cisterns, placed on each side, full of gold and silver. But take care you do not meddle with them. Before you enter the first hall, be sure to tuck up your vest, wrap it about you, and then pass through the second into the third, without stopping. Above all things, have a care that you do not touch the walls, so much as with your clothes, for if you do, you will die instantly. At the end of the third hall, you will find a door which opens into a garden planted with fine trees loaded with fruit. Walk directly across the garden by a path which will lead you to 5 steps that will bring you upon a terrace, where you will see a niche before you, and in that niche a lighted lamp. Take the lamp down and extinguish it. When you have thrown away the wick and poured out the liquor, put it in your vestband and bring it to me. Do not be afraid that the liquor will spoil your clothes, for it is not oil, and the lamp will be dry as soon as it is thrown out. If you should wish for any of the fruit of the garden, you may gather as much as you please. After these words, the magician drew a ring off his finger and put it on one of Alla ad Deen's, telling him that it was a preservative against all evil, while he should observe what he had prescribed to him. After this instruction he said, Go down boldly, child, and we shall both be rich all our lives. Alla ad Deen jumped into the cave, descended the steps, and found the 3 halls just as the African magician had described. He went through them with all the precaution the fear of death could inspire, crossed the garden without stopping, took down the lamp from the niche, threw out the wick and the liquor, and, as the magician had desired, put it in his vestband. But as he came down from the terrace, seeing it was perfectly dry, he stopped in the garden to observe the fruit, which he only had a glimpse of in crossing it. All the trees were loaded with extraordinary fruit of different colours on each tree. Some bore fruit entirely white, and some clear and transparent as crystal, some pale red, and others deeper, some green, blue, and purple, and others yellow. In short, there was fruit of all colours. The white were pearls, the clear and transparent diamonds, the deep red rubies, the paler rubies, the green emeralds, the blue turquoises, the purple amethysts, and those that were of yellow cast, sapphires. Alla ad Deen was altogether ignorant of their worth, and would have preferred figs and grapes, or any other fruits. But though he took them only for coloured glass of little value, yet he was so pleased with the variety of the colours, and the beauty and extraordinary size of the seeming fruit, that he resolved to gather some of every sort, and accordingly filled the 2 new purses his uncle had bought for him with his clothes. Some he wrapped up in the skirts of his vest, which was of silk, large and wrapping, and crammed his bosom as full as it could hold. Alla ad Deen, having thus loaded himself with riches he knew not the value of, returned through the 3 halls with the same precaution, made all the haste he could that he might not make his uncle wait, and soon arrived at the mouth of the cave, where the African magician expected him with the utmost impatience. As soon as Alla ad Deen saw him, he cried out, "Pray, uncle, lend me your hand to help me out." "Give me the lamp first," replied the magician. it will be troublesome to you." "Indeed, uncle," answered Alla ad Deen, "I cannot now. It is not troublesome to me, but I will as soon as I am up." The African magician was so obstinate that he would have the lamp before he would help him up; and Alla ad Deen, who had encumbered himself so much with his fruit that he could not well get at it, refused to give it to him till he was out of the cave. The African magician, provoked at this obstinate refusal, flew into a passion, threw a little of his incense into the fire, which he had taken care to keep in, and no sooner pronounced 2 magical words, than the stone which had closed the mouth of the cave moved into its place, with the earth over it in the same manner as it lay at the arrival of the magician and Alla ad Deen. This action of the African magician's plainly showed him to be neither Alla ad Deen's uncle nor Mustapha the tailor's brother, but a true African. Africa is a country whose inhabitants delight most in magic of any in the whole world, and he had applied himself to it from his youth. After 40 years' experience in enchantments, geomancy, fumigations, and reading of magic books, he had found out that there was in the world a wonderful lamp, the possession of which would render him more powerful than any monarch; and by a late operation of geomancy, he had discovered that this lamp lay concealed in a subterraneous place in the midst of China, in the situation already described. Fully persuaded of the truth of this discovery, he set out from the farthest part of Africa, and after a long and fatiguing journey came to the town nearest to this treasure. But though he had a certain knowledge of the place where the lamp was, he was not permitted to take it himself, nor to enter the subterraneous place, but must receive it from the hands of another person. For this reason he had addressed himself to Alla ad Deen, whom he looked upon as a young lad whose life was of no consequence, and fit to serve his purpose, resolving, as soon as he should get the lamp into his hands, to sacrifice him to his avarice and wickedness, by making the fumigation mentioned before, and repeating 2 magical words, the effect of which would remove the stone into its place, so that no witness would remain of the transaction. The blow he had given Alla ad Deen was intended to make him obey the more readily, and give him the lamp as soon as he should ask for it; but his too great precipitation, and his fear lest somebody should come that way during their dispute, and discover what he wished to keep secret, produced an effect quite contrary to what he had proposed to himself. When the African magician saw that all his hopes were frustrated for ever, he returned the same day for Africa, but went quite round the town, and at some distance from it, lest some persons who had observed him walk out with a boy, on seeing him come back without him, should entertain any suspicions and stop him. According to all appearances, there was no prospect of Alla ad Deen being any more heard of; but the magician, when he had contrived his death, forgot the ring he had put upon his finger, which preserved him, though he knew not its virtue. It may seem astonishing that the loss of that, together with the lamp, did not drive the magician to despair; but magicians are so much used to misfortunes and events contrary to their wishes, that they do not lay them to heart, but still feed themselves to the end of life with unsubstantial notions and chimeras. The surprise of Alla ad Deen, who had never suspected this treachery from his pretended uncle, after all his caresses and what he had done for him, is more easily to be imagined than expressed. When he found himself buried alive, he cried, and called out to his uncle, to tell him he was ready to give him the lamp, but in vain, since his cries could not be heard. He descended to the bottom of the steps, with a design to get into the garden, but the door which was opened before by enchantment was now shut by the same means. He then redoubled his cries and tears, sat down on the steps, without any hopes of ever seeing light again, and in a melancholy certainty of passing from the present darkness into that of a speedy death. End of section 16. Section 17 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 3. Section 17. The Story of Ala ad-Din, or the Wonderful Lamp, Part 2. Ala ad-Din remained in this state 2 days, without eating or drinking, and on the third looked upon death as inevitable. Clasping his hands with an entire resignation to the will of God, he said, "There is no strength or power but in the great and high God." In this action of joining his hands, he rubbed the ring which the magician had put on his finger, and of which he knew not yet the virtue. Immediately a genie of enormous size and frightful aspect rose out of the earth, his head reaching the roof of the vault, and said to him, "What wouldst thou have? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of all who may possess the ring on thy finger, I and the other slaves of that ring." At another time, Ala ad-Din, who had not been used to such appearances, would have been so frightened at the sight of so extraordinary a figure that he would not have been able to speak. But the danger he was in made him answer without hesitation, "Whoever thou art, deliver me from this place if thou art able." He had no sooner spoken these words than he found himself on the very spot where the magician had caused the earth to open. It was some time before his eyes could bear the light, after being so long in total darkness. But after he had endeavoured by degrees to support it, and began to look about him, he was much surprised not to find the earth open, and could not comprehend how he had got so soon out of its bowels. There was nothing to be seen but the place where the fire had been, by which he could nearly judge the situation of the cave. Then, turning himself towards the town, he perceived it at a distance in the midst of the gardens that surrounded it, and saw the way by which the magician had brought him. Returning God thanks to find himself once more in the world, he made the best of his way home. When he got within his mother's door, the joy to see her and his weakness for want of sustenance for 3 days made him faint, and he remained for a long time as dead. His mother, who had given him over for lost, seeing him in this condition, omitted nothing to bring him to himself. As soon as he had recovered, the first words he spoke were, "Pray, mother, give me something to eat, for I have not put a morsel of anything into my mouth these 3 days." His mother brought what she had, and set it before him. "My son," said she, "be not too eager, for it is dangerous. Eat but little at a time, and take care of yourself. Besides, I would not have you talk. You will have time enough to tell me what has happened to you when you are recovered. It is a great comfort to me to see you again, after the affliction I have been in since Friday, and the pains I have taken to learn what was become of you." Ala ad-Din took his mother's advice, and ate and drank moderately. When he had done, "Mother," said he to her, "I cannot help complaining of you for abandoning me so easily to the discretion of a man who had a design to kill me, and who at this very moment thinks my death certain. You believed he was my uncle as well as I, and what other thoughts could we entertain of a man who was so kind to me, and made such advantageous proffers? But I must tell you, mother, he is a rogue and a cheat, and only made me those promises to accomplish my death. But for what reason, neither you nor I can guess. For my part, I can assure you, I never gave him any cause to justify the least ill treatment from him. You shall judge yourself when you have heard all that passed from the time I left you till he came to the execution of his wicked design." Ala ad-Din then related to his mother all that had happened to him from the Friday when the magician took him to see the palaces and gardens about the town, and what fell out in the way till they came to the place between the 2 mountains, where the great prodigy was to be performed. How, with incense which the magician threw into the fire, and some magical words which he pronounced, the earth opened and discovered a cave, which led to an inestimable treasure. He forgot not the blow the magician had given him, in what manner he softened again, and engaged him by great promises, and putting a ring to his finger to go down into the cave. He did not omit the least circumstance of what he saw in crossing the 3 halls and the garden, and his taking the lamp, which he pulled out of his bosom and showed to his mother, as well as the transparent fruit of different colours which he had gathered in the garden as he returned. But though these fruits were precious stones, brilliant as the sun, and the reflection of a lamp which then lighted the room might have led them to think they were of great value, she was as ignorant of their worth as her son, and cared nothing for them. She had been bred in a low rank of life, and her husband's poverty prevented his being possessed of jewels, nor had she, her relations, or neighbours ever seen any, so that we must not wonder that she regarded them as things of no value, and only pleasing to the eye by the variety of their colours. Alla ad Deen put them behind one of the cushions of the sofa, and continued his story, telling his mother that when he returned to the mouth of the cave, upon his refusal to give the magician the lamp till he should get out, the stone, by his throwing some incense into the fire, and using 2 or 3 magical words, shut him in, and the earth closed. He could not help bursting into tears at the representation of the miserable condition he was in at finding himself buried alive in a dismal cave, till, by the touching of his ring, the virtue of which he was till then an entire stranger to, he, properly speaking, came to life again. When he had finished his story, he said to his mother, "I need say no more, you know the rest. This is my adventure, and the danger I have been exposed to since you saw me." Alla ad Deen's mother heard with so much patience as not to interrupt him this surprising and wonderful relation, notwithstanding it could be no small affliction to a mother who loved her son tenderly. But yet, in the most moving part, which discovered the perfidy of the African magician, she could not help showing, by marks of the greatest indignation, how much she detested him, and when her son had finished his story, she broke out into 1,000 reproaches against that vile impostor. She called him perfidious traitor, barbarian, assassin, deceiver, magician, and an enemy and destroyer of mankind. "Without doubt, child," added she, "he is a magician, and they are plagues to the world, and by their enchantments and sorceries have commerce with the devil. Bless God for preserving you from his wicked designs, for your death would have been inevitable if you had not called upon him and implored his assistance." She said a great deal more against the magician's treachery, but finding that whilst she talked, Alla ad Deen, who had not slept for 3 days and nights, began to doze, she left him to his repose and retired. Alla ad Deen, who had not closed his eyes while he was in the subterraneous abode, slept very soundly till late the next morning, when the first thing he said to his mother was that he wanted something to eat, and that she could not do him a greater kindness than to give him his breakfast. "Alas, child," said she, "I have not a bit of bread to give you. You ate up all the provisions I had in the house yesterday. But have a little patience, and it shall not be long before I will bring you some. I have a little cotton which I have spun. I will go and sell it, buy bread and something for our dinner." "Mother," replied Alla ad Deen, "keep your cotton for another time, and give me the lamp I brought home with me yesterday. I will go and sell it, and the money I shall get for it will serve both for breakfast and dinner, and perhaps supper too." Alla ad Deen's mother took the lamp and said to her son, "Here it is, but it is very dirty. If it was a little cleaner, I believe it would bring something more." She took some fine sand and water to clean it, but had no sooner begun to rub it, than in an instant a hideous genie of gigantic size appeared before her, and said to her in a voice like thunder, "What wouldst thou have?
I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of all those who have that lamp in their hands, I and the other slaves of the lamp." Alla ad Deen's mother, terrified at the sight of the genie, fainted, when Alla ad Deen, who had seen such a phantom in the cavern, snatched the lamp out of his mother's hand, and said to the genie boldly, "I am hungry, bring me something to eat." The genie disappeared immediately, and in an instant returned with a large silver tray, holding 12 covered dishes of the same metal, which contained the most delicious viands, 6 large white bread cakes on 2 plates, 2 flagons of wine, and 2 silver cups. All these he placed upon a carpet and disappeared. This was done before Alla ad Deen's mother recovered from her swoon. Alla ad Deen had fetched some water and sprinkled it in her face to recover her. Whether that or the smell of the meal brought her to life again, it was not long before she came to herself. "Mother," said Alla ad Deen, "do not mind this. Get up and come and eat. Here is what will put you in heart, and at the same time satisfy my extreme hunger. Do not let such delicious meat get cold." His mother was much surprised to see the great tray, 12 dishes, 6 loaves, the 2 flagons and cups, and to smell the savoury odour which exhaled from the dishes. "Child," said she, "to whom are we obliged for this great plenty and liberality? Has the sultan been made acquainted with our poverty, and had compassion on us?" "It is no matter, mother," said Alla ad Deen. "Let us sit down and eat, for you have almost as much need of a good breakfast as myself. When we have done, I will tell you." Accordingly, both mother and son sat down and ate with the better relish as the table was so well furnished. But all the time Alla ad Deen's mother could not forbear looking at and admiring the tray and dishes, though she could not judge whether they were silver or any other metal, and the novelty more than the value attracted her attention. The mother and son sat at breakfast till it was dinner time, and then they thought it would be best to put the 2 meals together. Yet after this they found they should have enough left for supper, and 2 meals for the next day. When Alla ad Deen's mother had taken away and set by what was left, she went and sat down by her son on the sofa, saying, "I expect now that you should satisfy my impatience, and tell me exactly what passed between the genie and you while I was in a swoon," which he readily complied with. She was in as great amazement at what her son told her as at the appearance of the genie, and said to him, "But, son, what have we to do with genie? I never heard that any of my acquaintance had ever seen one. How came that vile genie to address himself to me, and not to you, to whom he had appeared before in the cave?" "Mother," answered Alla ad Deen, "the genie you saw is not the one who appeared to me, though he resembles him in size. No, they had quite different persons and habits. They belong to different masters. If you remember, he that I first saw called himself the slave of the ring on my finger, and this you saw called himself the slave of the lamp you had in your hand. But I believe you did not hear him, for I think you fainted as soon as he began to speak." "What!" cried the mother, "was the lamp then the occasion of that cursed genie addressing himself rather to me than to you? Ah, my son, take it out of my sight, and put it where you please. I will never touch it. I had rather you would sell it than run the hazard of being frightened to death again by touching it. And if you would take my advice, you would part also with the ring, and not have anything to do with genie, who, as our prophet has told us, are only devils." "With your leave, mother," replied Alla ad Deen, "I shall now take care how I sell a lamp which may be so serviceable both to you and me. Have not you been an eye witness of what it has procured us? And it shall still continue to furnish us with subsistence and maintenance. You may suppose, as I do, that my false and wicked uncle would not have taken so much pains, and undertaken so long and tedious a journey,
if it had not been to get into his possession this wonderful lamp, which he preferred before all the gold and silver which he knew was in the halls, and which I have seen with my own eyes. He knew too well the worth of this lamp, not to prefer it to so great a treasure. And since chance hath discovered the virtue of it to us, let us make a profitable use of it, without making any great show and exciting the envy and jealousy of our neighbours. However, since the genie frighten you so much, I will take it out of your sight, and put it where I may find it when I want it. The ring I cannot resolve to part with, for without that you had never seen me again. And though I am alive now, perhaps if it was gone, I might not be so some moments hence. Therefore, I hope you will give me leave to keep it, and to wear it always on my finger. Who knows what dangers you and I may be exposed to, which neither of us can foresee, and from which it may deliver us?" As Alla ad Deen's arguments were just, his mother had nothing to say against them. She only replied that he might do what he pleased. For her part, she would have nothing to do with genii, but would wash her hands of them, and never say anything more about them. By the next night they had eaten all the provisions the genie had brought, and the next day Alla ad Deen, who could not bear the thoughts of hunger, putting one of the silver dishes under his vest, went out early to sell it, and addressing himself to a Jew whom he met in the streets, took him aside, and pulling out the plate, asked him if he would buy it. The cunning Jew took the dish, examined it, and as soon as he found that it was good silver, asked Alla ad Deen at how much he valued it. Alla ad Deen, who knew not its value, and never had been used to such traffic, told him he would trust to his judgment and honour. The Jew was somewhat confounded at this plain dealing, and doubting whether Alla ad Deen understood the material or the full value of what he offered to sell, took a piece of gold out of his purse and gave it him, though it was but the 60th part of the worth of the plate. Alla ad Deen, taking the money very eagerly, retired with so much haste that the Jew, not content with the exorbitancy of his profit, was vexed he had not penetrated into his ignorance, and was going to run after him to endeavour to get some change out of the piece of gold. But he ran so fast, and had got so far, that it would have been impossible for him to overtake him. Before Alla ad Deen went home, he called at the baker's, bought some cakes of bread, changed his money, and on his return gave the rest to his mother, who went and purchased provisions enough to last them some time. After this manner they lived, till Alla ad Deen had sold the 12 dishes singly, as necessity pressed, to the Jew for the same money, who after the first time durst not offer him less, for fear of losing so good a bargain. When he had sold the last dish, he had recourse to the tray, which weighed 10 times as much as the dishes, and would have carried it to his old purchaser, but that it was too large and cumbersome. Therefore he was obliged to bring him home with him to his mother's, where, after the Jew had examined the weight of the tray, he laid down 10 pieces of gold, with which Alla ad Deen was very well satisfied. They lived on these 10 pieces in a frugal manner, and Alla ad Deen, though used to an idle life, had left off playing with young lads of his own age ever since his adventure with the African magician. He spent his time in walking about and conversing with decent people, with whom he gradually got acquainted. Sometimes he would stop at the principal merchants' shops, where people of distinction met, and listen to their discourse, by which he gained some little knowledge of the world. When all the money was spent, Alla ad Deen had recourse again to the lamp. He took it in his hand, looked for the part where his mother had rubbed it with the sand, rubbed it also, when the genie immediately appeared and said, "What wouldst thou have? I am ready to obey thee as thy slave, and the slave of all those who have that lamp in their hands, I and the other slaves of the lamp." "I am hungry," said Alla ad Deen. "Bring me something to eat." The genie disappeared, and presently returned with a tray, the same number of covered dishes as before, set them down, and vanished. Alla ad Deen's mother, knowing what her son was going to do, went out about some business on purpose to avoid being in the way when the genie came, and when she returned was almost as much surprised as before at the prodigious effect of the lamp. However, she sat down with her son, and when they had eaten as much as they liked, she set enough by to last them 2 or 3 days. As soon as Alla ad Deen found that their provisions were expended, he took one of the dishes and went to look for his Jew chapman. But passing by a goldsmith's shop, who had the character of a very fair and honest man, the goldsmith, perceiving him, called to him and said, "My lad, I have often observed you go by, loaded as you are at present, and talk with such a Jew, and then come back again empty-handed. I imagine that you carry something which you sell to him. But perhaps you do not know that he is the greatest rogue even among the Jews, and is so well known that nobody of prudence will have anything to do with him. What I tell you is for your own good. If you will show me what you now carry, and it is to be sold, I will give you the full worth of it, or I will direct you to other merchants who will not cheat you." The hopes of getting more money for his plate induced Alla ad Deen to pull it from under his vest and show it to the goldsmith, who at first sight saw that it was made of the finest silver, asked him if he had sold such as that to the Jew, when Alla ad Deen told him that he had sold him 12 such for a piece of gold each. "What a villain!" cried the goldsmith. "But," added he, "my son, what is past cannot be recalled. By showing you the value of this plate, which is of the finest silver we use in our shops, I will let you see how much the Jew has cheated you." The goldsmith took a pair of scales, weighed the dish, and, after he had mentioned how much an ounce of fine silver cost, assured him that his plate would fetch by weight 60 pieces of gold, which he offered to pay down immediately. "If you dispute my honesty," said he, "you may go to any other of our trade, and if he gives you more, I will be bound to forfeit twice as much, for we gain only the fashion of the plate we buy, and that the fairest dealing Jews are not contented with." Alla ad Deen thanked him for his fair dealing, so greatly to his advantage, took the gold, and never after went to any other person, but sold him all his dishes and the tray, and had as much for them as the weight came to. Though Alla ad Deen and his mother had an inexhaustible treasure in the lamp, and might have had whatever they wished for, yet they lived with the same frugality as before, except that Alla ad Deen dressed better. As for his mother, she wore no clothes but what she earned by spinning cotton. After their manner of living, it may easily be supposed that the money for which Alla ad Deen had sold the dishes and tray was sufficient to maintain them some time. During this interval, Alla ad Deen frequented the shops of the principal merchants, where they sold cloth of gold and silver, linens, silk stuffs, and jewellery, but oftentimes joining in their conversation, acquired a knowledge of the world and respectable demeanour. By his acquaintance among the jewellers he came to know that the fruits which he had gathered when he took the lamp were, instead of coloured glass, stones of inestimable value. But he had the prudence not to mention this to any one, not even to his mother. One day, as Alla ad Deen was walking about the town, he heard an order proclaimed, commanding the people to shut up their shops and houses, and keep within doors, while the Princess Buddir al-Buddoor, the sultan's daughter, went to the baths and returned. This proclamation inspired Alla ad Deen with eager curiosity to see the princess's face, which he could not do without admission into the house of some acquaintance, and then only through a window, which did not satisfy him, when he considered that the princess, when she went to the baths, would be closely veiled. But to gratify his curiosity, he presently thought of a scheme which succeeded. It was to place himself behind the door of the bath, which was so situated that he could not fail of seeing her face. Alla ad Deen had not waited long before the princess came, and he could see her plainly through a chink of the door without being discovered. She was attended by a great crowd of ladies, slaves, and eunuchs, who walked on each side and behind her. When she came within 3 or 4 paces of the door of the baths, she took off her veil, and gave Alla ad Deen an opportunity of a full view. As soon as Alla ad Deen had seen the princess, his heart could not withstand those inclinations so charming an object always inspires. The princess was the most beautiful brunette in the world. Her eyes were large, lively, and sparkling. Her looks sweet and modest. Her nose was of a just proportion and without a fault. Her mouth small. Her lips of a vermilion red and charmingly agreeable symmetry. In a word, all the features of her face were perfectly regular. It was not therefore surprising that Alla ad Deen, who had never before seen such a blaze of charms, was dazzled, and his senses ravished by such an assemblage. With all these perfections, the princess had so fine a form and so majestic an air, that the sight of her was sufficient to inspire love and admiration. After the princess had passed by and entered the baths, Alla ad Deen remained some time astonished and in a kind of ecstasy, retracing and imprinting the idea of so charming an object deeply in his mind. But at last, considering that the princess was gone past him, and that when she returned from the bath her back would be towards him, and then veiled, he resolved to quit his hiding place and go home. He could not so far conceal his uneasiness but that his mother perceived it, was surprised to see him so much more thoughtful and melancholy than usual, and asked what had happened to make him so, or if he was ill. He returned her no answer, but sat carelessly down on the sofa, and remained silent, musing on the image of the charming Buddir al Buddoor. His mother, who was dressing supper, pressed him no more. When it was ready, she served it up, and perceiving that he gave no attention to it, urged him to eat, but had much ado to persuade him to change his place, which when he did, he ate much less than usual, all the time cast down his eyes, and observed so profound a silence that she could not obtain a word in answer to all the questions she put, in order to find the reason of so extraordinary an alteration. After supper she asked him again why he was so melancholy, but could get no information, and he determined to go to bed rather than give her the least satisfaction. Without examining how he passed the night, his mind full, as it was, with the charms of the princess, I shall only observe that as he sat next day on the sofa opposite his mother, as she was spinning cotton, he spoke to her in these words: "I perceive, mother, that my silence yesterday has much troubled you. I was not, nor am I, sick, as I fancy you believed, but I assure you that what I felt then and now endure is worse than any disease. I cannot explain what ails me, but doubt not what I am going to relate will inform you. It was not proclaimed in this quarter of the town, and therefore you could know nothing of it, that the sultan's daughter was yesterday to go to the baths. I heard this as I walked about the town, and an order was issued that all the shops should be shut up in her way thither, and everybody keep within doors, to leave the streets free for her and her attendants. As I was not then far from the bath, I had a great curiosity to see the princess's face, and as it occurred to me that the princess, when she came nigh the door of the bath, would pull her veil off, I resolved to conceal myself behind the door. You know the situation of the door, and may imagine that I must have had a full view of her. The princess threw off her veil, and I had the happiness of seeing her lovely face with the greatest security. This, mother, was the cause of my melancholy and silence yesterday. I love the princess with more violence than I can express, and as my passion increases every moment, I cannot live without the possession of the amiable Buddir al Buddoor, and am resolved to ask her in marriage of the sultan her father." Alla ad Deen's mother listened with surprise to what her son told her, but when he talked of asking the princess in marriage, she could not help bursting out into a loud laugh. Alla ad Deen would have gone on with his rhapsody, but she interrupted him. "Alas, child," said she, "what are you thinking of? You must be mad to talk thus." "I assure you, mother," replied Alla ad Deen, "that I am not mad, but in my right senses. I foresaw that you would reproach me with folly and extravagance. But I must tell you once more that I am resolved to demand the princess of the sultan in marriage, and your remonstrances shall not prevent me." "Indeed, son," replied the mother seriously, "I cannot help telling you that you have forgotten yourself, and if you would put this resolution of yours in execution, I do not see whom you can prevail upon to venture to make the proposal for you." "You yourself," replied he immediately. "I go to the sultan?" answered the mother, amazed and surprised. "I shall be cautious how I engage in such an errand. Why, who are you, son," continued she, "that you can have the assurance to think of your sultan's daughter? Have you forgotten that your father was one of the poorest tailors in the capital, and that I am of no better extraction? And do not you know that sultans never marry their daughters but to princes, sons of sovereigns like themselves?" "Mother," answered Alla ad Deen, "I have already told you that I foresaw all that you have said or can say, and tell you again that neither your discourse nor your remonstrances shall make me change my mind. I have told you that you must ask the princess in marriage for me. It is a favour I desire of you, and I beg of you not to refuse, unless you would rather see me in my grave than by your compliance give me new life." The good old woman was much embarrassed when she found Alla ad Deen obstinately persisting in so wild a design. "My son," said she again, "I am your mother, who brought you into the world, and there is nothing that is reasonable but I would readily do for you. If I were to go and treat about your marriage with some neighbour's daughter, whose circumstances were equal with yours, I would do it with all my heart, and even then they would expect you should have some little estate or fortune, or be of some trade. When such poor folks as we are wish to marry, the first thing they ought to think of is how to live. But without reflecting on the meanness of your birth, and the little merit and fortune you have to recommend you, you aim at the highest pitch of exaltation, and your pretensions are no less than to demand in marriage the daughter of your sovereign, who with one single word can crush you to pieces. I say nothing of what respects yourself. I leave you to reflect on what you have to do, if you have ever so little thought. I come now to consider what concerns myself. How could so extraordinary a thought come into your head, as that I should go to the sultan and make a proposal to him to give his daughter in marriage to you? Suppose I had, not to say the boldness, but the impudence, to present myself before the sultan, and make so extravagant a request, to whom should I address myself to be introduced to his majesty? Do you not think the first person I should speak to would take me for a madwoman, and chastise me as I should deserve? Suppose, however, that there is no difficulty in presenting myself for an audience of the sultan, and I know there is none to those who go to petition for justice, which he distributes equally among his subjects. I know too that to those who ask a favour he grants it with pleasure when he sees it is deserved, and the persons are worthy of it. But is that your case? Do you think you have merited the honour you would have me ask for you? Are you worthy of it? What have you done to claim such a favour, either for your prince or country? How have you distinguished yourself? If you have done nothing to merit so high a distinction, nor are worthy of it, with what face shall I ask it? How can I open my mouth to make the proposal to the sultan? His majestic presence and the lustre of his court would absolutely confound me, who used even to tremble before my dear husband, your father, when I asked him for anything. There is another reason, my son, which you do not think of, which is that nobody ever goes to ask a favour of the Sultan without a present. But what presents have you to make? And if you had any that were worthy of the least attention of so great a monarch, what proportion could they bear to the favour you would ask? Therefore, reflect well on what you are about, and consider that you aspire to an object which it is impossible for you to obtain." Alla ad Deen heard very calmly all that his mother could say to dissuade him from his design, and after he had weighed her representations in all points, replied, "I own, mother, it is great rashness in me to presume to carry my pretensions so far, and a great want of consideration to ask you, with so much heat and precipitancy, to go and make the proposal to the sultan without first taking proper measures to procure a favourable reception, and therefore beg your pardon. But be not surprised that through the violence of my passion I did not at first see every measure necessary to procure me the happiness I seek. I love the princess, or rather I adore her, and shall always persevere in my design of marrying her. I am obliged to you for the hint you have given me, and look upon it as the first step I ought to take to procure the happy issue I promise myself. You say it is not customary to go to the sultan without a present, and that I have nothing worthy of his acceptance. As to the necessity of a present, I agree with you, and own that I never thought of it. But as to what you say that I have nothing fit to offer, do not you think, mother, that what I brought home with me the day on which I was delivered from an inevitable death may be an acceptable present? I mean what you and I both took for coloured glass, but now I am undeceived, and can tell you that they are jewels of inestimable value, and fit for the greatest monarchs. I know the worth of them by frequenting the shops, and you may take my word that all the precious stones which I saw in the most capital jewellers' possessions were not to be compared to those we have, either for size or beauty, and yet they value theirs at an excessive price. In short, neither you nor I know the value of ours. But be it as it may, by the little experience I have, I am persuaded that they will be received very favourably by the sultan. You have a large porcelain dish fit to hold them. Fetch it, and let us see how they will look when we have arranged them according to their different colours." Alla ad Deen's mother brought the china dish, when he took the jewels out of the 2 purses in which he had kept them, and placed them in order according to his fancy. But the brightness and lustre they emitted in the daytime, and the variety of the colours, so dazzled the eyes both of mother and son, that they were astonished beyond measure, for they had only seen them by the light of the lamp, and though the latter had beheld them pendant on the trees like fruit beautiful to the eye, yet, as he was then but a boy, he looked on them only as glittering playthings. After they had admired the beauty of the jewels some time, Alla ad Deen said to his mother, "Now you cannot excuse yourself from going to the sultan, under pretext of not having a present to make him, since here is one which will gain you a favourable reception." Though the good widow, notwithstanding the beauty and lustre of the precious stones, did not believe them so valuable as her son estimated them, she thought such a present might nevertheless be agreeable to the sultan, but still she hesitated at the request. "My son," said she, "I cannot conceive that your present will have its desired effect, or that the sultan will look upon me with a favourable eye. I am sure that if I attempt to deliver your strange message, I shall have no power to open my mouth. Therefore I shall not only lose my labour, but the present, which you say is so invaluable, and shall return home again in confusion, to tell you that your hopes are frustrated. I have represented the consequence, and you ought to believe me. But," added she, I will exert my best endeavour to please you, and wish I may have power to ask the sultan as you would have me; but certainly he will either laugh at me, send me back like a fool, or be in so great a rage as to make us both the victims of his fury." She used many other arguments to endeavour to make him change his mind, but the charms of the princess had made too great an impression on his heart for him to be dissuaded from his design. He persisted in importuning his mother to execute his resolution, and she, as much out of tenderness as for fear he should be guilty of greater extravagance, complied with his request. Section 17.